Thanks for coming back. We are going to continue some work on the non-homestead property designations. Not even sure how to describe that, Bill, yet. An act relating to defining new categories of non-homestead property. Abby, you described it for us. Thank you. Do you want to come up maybe we can go through the actual bill language, which we haven't done yet, and sort of pause on each section to talk about it.
So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm wondering, Saoirse, I didn't think ahead to do this, but would it be possible to put the flow chart that I used the last time?
Yep.
So the committee can look at that too. I think that is helpful. But I would be happy to walk you through the actual language. And that is posted under my name. So section 1, there are a few sections in this bill. The first section is where the meat of the bill is, and that's creating these new definitions. They are only within the non-homestead property tax classification or property classification. So any homestead and any exempt property is not going to be subject to these definitions. And I'm saying definition just because that's how they are put into statute. But the way that I'm characterizing them, as you see, is that in the title, these are really categories of non-homestead property. It's not a new classification. You still have homestead subject to the homestead property tax and non-homestead subject to the homestead property tax. This does not create any new taxes or tax structure.
Okay. I guess I didn't understand. Is this on the way to creating?
It could be. This would, I mean, that's up to your discretion, whether you would change the taxation or exemption, or, I mean, this is really giving you new data, new categories, new ways of defining and parsing out types of property.
Yeah, okay.
Because currently there are different categories on the grand list, but they are neither in statute nor uniform in any way. And there's even a catch-all of other. So there's a lot of types of property that when the legislature has had questions, particularly about secondary residences or seasonal residences, there's nothing to point to. And JFO, I'm sure, would be best placed, or the tax department, to talk about the data that they can get from the grand list. But currently, because of the lack of definitions in statute, there's no way to say with 100% certainty, here are all of the secondary residences in the state, or here are all of the commercial properties.
And so, so once we have these uniformly described, then the next step might be to ask, where are these properties located?
Correct.
And
where and how many and what is the value?
So the kind of cool mapping that we saw last week from that man who's the cool maps. We have seen that done with GIS info here in Vermont, but it's not actually, because the other category means different things in different municipalities because of a number of reasons. It's like really not robust.
You said not sort of uniform across the grand list. Is that because it's currently left to the discretion of each individual town unless there's?
That's correct. And not by any fault of their own. There are no definitions currently to determine and to provide guidance as to what is exactly a secondary home, for example.
Making all these changes at the same time we move to statewide appraisals, there would be so much organization. Okay.
Also on that note, this bill does not shift who would be carrying out the valuation and appraisal. That is in that different bill.
So they can speak to each other, but they can also remain mutually exclusive. Representative Andrews.
Just at first blush, it does not appear that this bill right now imagines a category for like a mixed-use property, and I wonder if that was intentional, or I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Hate to speak to intent, since that's more of a policy decision, but the logic behind this is that properties would typically fall into one category. However, mixed use could separate properties, and there are already properties on the grand list that are split. So for example, if you have a home business, or I'll say you have a rental at home, that's an easier example. Any rental use of a homestead dwelling is considered non-homestead, so that's already separated out and put into a non-homestead category. So that would still be possible. But the general logic is that properties would be within one category.
Or am I remembering, maybe we talked about sort of two different approaches? You could either have like a category that took primacy, so that if it was a little commercial, you have to be all commercial, or that you could have a parcel that was a certain percent one thing and a percent another, and you maybe paid a tax bill at two different rates depending on the percent of the building that was one thing or that.
Yes. Doesn't get at the actual taxation, so it doesn't get into that level. But in terms of business use, currently it is the portion. So it is also a percentage based on square footage.
And so
That could perhaps be clarified in this, depending on which approach you wanted to take, like a screen category.
And like the lister would do this assessment on every property, or the owner would self-attest to?
So this draft doesn't change current law, so it would be up to the lister in the town. And then if the homeowner contested that, they would go through the current process where they grieve the lister's decision, and then it goes to the Board of Civil Authority, and then it could go to PBR or Superior Court. So that doesn't change that process in this bill. But you could certainly include some sort of attestation similar to the home, but there is nothing like that currently, because that's done with the homestead for purposes of the property tax credit. But that would be a new requirement to put on homestead owners, to have them declare, this is my property's use.
For current law, when properties are divided between homestead and non-homestead, is there sort of a minimum percentage that can be one or the other to bother with that?
For business use, yes, it's 25%, I think, of the square footage that's in the statute. Any rental use of a dwelling, or if it's in a separate structure on a homestead property, is always non-homestead. So there is precedent for that sort of parsing percentage-wise, square footage. I'm assuming the square footage was because you can measure it. It's a little more bright line.
So, sorry to play the hypothetical game, but under that.
This bill is nothing but hypothetical games. That's what we're gonna be doing until we finish it.
I have a room in my basement that I rent 1 week a year on Airbnb or a short-term rental platform. And then my entire house would be ineligible as a homestead.
Under current law?
Is that
Question?
Well, I guess I was just hearing if any portion of your house is a rental, you're then non-homestead. And so that was the extreme example of that I could come up with. And I don't know whether I'm asking about current or future law of both.
Let me just pull up the statute. It's not the entire
Because maybe it's
Sorry, let's just look at that. It's not the entire property that becomes, it's only the portion that's used. The complexity with that example is most likely they're using the bathroom and the kitchen, assuming in that. Or if they're just in the basement, then that's the portion that would turn into non-homestead. Just want to pull up the definition. Can read that to you.
But I think, Abby, is there something about, and maybe it's sort of outside of your usual purview, but the percentage of time a rental is a rental to make it a rental, or is there anything like that?
I think when you're thinking of the time limitation, that is for short-term rentals within the meals and rooms tax context, not for property tax. So under statute for property tax purposes, a homestead does not include any portion of a dwelling that is rented, and a dwelling is not a homestead for any portion of the year in which it is rented. So 1 week could.
I wonder how much compliance there is with that current
Are
For tax.
required to declare any rental income on the homestead, the household income form. So there is sort of some assuming individuals are voluntarily complying, there is some cross-referencing that the department has access to between forms.
So let us go, I think we've had our big picture questions answered. Let's go through the definitions of the categories, so that we can have hypothetical questions about those.
So on the first page, starting on line 16, you have the first definition here. So, or actually jumping up a little bit, I'll start with subdivision 17. So it's all non-homestead property as is already defined under current law shall be categorized as defined in this new subdivision. So moving on to line 16, affordable housing has the same meaning as an existing definition in Title 24. And I, again, would defer to housing experts for really examples of these types of housing, but in general, affordable housing is that 30% of income. Anything below that is affordable housing. And then there are some other conditions. There is language here that explicitly includes units that are subject to rent restrictions, both under federal or state law. And this is pretty broad. So it includes one or more of the following programs. But it includes Section 8, moderate rehabilitation, Section 8, housing choice vouchers, or Section 236, or Section 515 on rural development rental housing. These are some existing definitions in current law, particularly within the affordable housing area. So that's a fairly broad definition for affordable housing, and the intent is to bring in, or the purpose is to bring in any type of rental that falls within that definition, because there's a further definition for rental housing that would not apply to rental units that aren't affordable housing. Because there are two types of housing definitions. If there aren't any questions there, and I'd be happy to take questions and bring them back to folks who work more in this area than me, if you think of any later. Moving on to page 2, commercial. This is any non-homestead property used for business purpose that is not otherwise categorized. So this is the catch-all, so that there's no other category. It's kind of like the existing other category in the grand list, but it's really for business purposes and pulls in anything that isn't being used. Because again, no homestead property is being categorized here. So it's just saying anything that's not under another definition is going to be considered commercial. There is a separate definition for industrial, and this was modeled on language that passed last year or 2 years ago in sales tax relating to manufacturing. It's property used to manufacture, process, fabricate, or finish items for wholesale and retail. And it does include agricultural commodity processing, so it's also fairly broad. On line 7 of page 2, the open land and structures definition is one of the more complex and trying to be broad, but is complex. It has some definitions within the definition. So I'll try and parse those out. So first, for land, it applies to forest land, agricultural land, and unproductive land, irrespective of that land's enrollment in current use. So it could be enrolled, it might not be enrolled, it doesn't matter. If it's agricultural, forest land, or unproductive land, then it would be in this category. It also includes structures that are not human habitation, so fences, silos, barns, that are on that forest land, agricultural land, or unproductive land. And then there is language which is modeled on open space land definitions that has some use requirements. So it does require this land to have sort of a public purpose. And then there's a list there of preserving, enhancing conservation purposes. So one thing I would note is if you don't, yes.
Finish your sentence.
I would just say that you could, after thinking through this several times, you might choose not to include those use requirements because that does limit somewhat. Otherwise, it's all agricultural land, unproductive land, or forest land, and this does limit it to sort of public and conservation purposes, but just flagging that.
But it's an or, right?
Yes, it could be any of these. However, it is a limitation by requiring it to have one of those uses.
I mean, you just answered it a little bit, but I guess at first, third reading or whatever, it feels oddly specific around one category with the value, whereas it seems like the rest we're not ascribing value or lack of value, so that, yeah. So, was there, can you speak a little more towards the intent?
Would you like me to speak towards the intent?
It is based on open space land definition, so trying to get at that type of land, but I would defer to the chair.
I think it's an open question. So we went back and forth a lot about finding a definition that encompassed everything that wasn't referencing existing statutes that didn't apply too much, given that there's so much existing statute that comes close to these categories. What we did talk about a lot is the idea that we don't have to place value on the types of way the land is used, because current use designations would sit on top of this category. And so we don't need to get into those weeds. And so I would say it actually makes more sense to not have it to not narrow it to sort of usefulness, because I think the difference between an unusable plot of land and a usable plot of land, and then a usable plot of land that's being used would be like current use is what would sort of thread the difference between those things. And we don't have to do it in this, but I'm like.
All land has a use.
Yes.
And
yes, yeah.
I think maybe Carol's.
You could go first.
I guess one of the things that I'm trying to imagine, and I might be getting like conflating different land uses at this point, but let's pretend I am a non-homestead second home person, and I'm wildly wealthy and I've got a multi-million-dollar property, which means I have a lovely home and 150 acres. So in that case, could I arguably say, a percentage of my land belongs under this category?
Yes, so this would exclude the home. So that is, you're saying it's a second home. Sorry, I just want to clarify. Yes, so that's not a homestead. So it would be within the non-homestead category. It would not include dwellings for human habitation. So then it would have to categorize all of this other land, whether it's put into current use or not, as open land and structures.
I'm just sort of imagining the theoretical world where different tax structures are applied to different types of non-homestead uses, that we might accidentally give a tax break to very wealthy people that really, I think, when we're talking about working lands makes more sense, but maybe when we're talking about lands held by the 1% that doesn't may not make the same sense. So I'm just throwing that out there.
So there are two different tracks for, I'm just thinking current use and how someone with a large tract of land is probably classifying it for property tax purposes. If they have more than, so it's 25 acres to be able to enroll in as forest land use, and then you carve out the 2 acres around the house. You'd have to have at least 27 acres. So most likely that type of property is already benefiting from current use. Yeah, I don't really have any other insights, but
Thank you.
those are definitely the type of parsing that I think is raised by this definition in particular.
Demro, are you Carol and then Carl and then Kurt? I don't know if I know still on the seat.
Emerald and then Carl?
Sorry, Kurt.
Just call us Curl.
Carl, Kurt.
So, and I'm thinking, okay, so, no, I had my question answered, I think, which is, it's up in the air, but, okay.
Carl.
I can't remember the sequence.
Okay. So just, I want to go back to Representative Andrews' example just for a sec. So let's just say you've got, again, a seasonal non-homestead, or not a vacation home, year-round vacation home. on, instead of 150 acres, let's say 20 acres. So they're not eligible for current use. Would you still, I guess, how would we treat the rest of that property? Would we have a carve out, a 2-acre carve out for the house like current use? The dwelling like, actually it's not a dwelling because no one lives there, for the vacation home? And then classify the rest of the land as, and the other question in my mind is, whose job is it gonna be to figure all this out?
Currently the listers, I'll start backwards. That actually is I'm realizing the other definitions for seasonal and non-seasonal secondary dwellings are not explicit as to that house site. I was thinking more in terms of where would the land apply.
Yeah.
It might, if the committee wants to be very clear that the dwelling would be separate in terms of categories, I would suggest adding language saying that the land would be in that category, but the seasonal dwelling would be in the other category, or non-seasonal type secondary.
So I think there are gonna be, certainly gonna be properties that, are gonna be seasonal. I mean, think about a vacation home on a ski mountain, right? And they might be packed in pretty tight, if they're single like family sized homes. They're gonna be on less land than could be
Right.
eligible for current use. So I guess just trying to think of how to deal with that dwelling and the land around it versus anything else.
Exactly. I think that gets to what is the policy decision that you want to make about a secondary home that is non-seasonal, so it could be used year-round surrounding land.
Yep.
Surrounding land in its own category.
Kurt.
I was wondering if you could have a category of current use land. And then just separate the two that way. For open land, is that under current use and that not under current use?
Could, I think that's already split out. In terms of getting the data, you already have that on the grand list, so I'm not sure what the additional. Yes, yes, you could. I'm just trying to think through what that could even be a subcategory within this.
But I think the current use functions already as sort of an effective overlay. And because it has its whole own universe, we could narrow our scope slightly by not engaging with that universe.
But I'm just wondering how these categories are going to be used in the future and whether we're going to need to have a subcategory of current use so that we don't tax it differently.
Well, that's the thing about current use is that it has its own tax treatment already, and so it would be applied sort of on top of any other use. The open land, we're going back and forth between like, how do we deal with parcels that are mixed and then this open land and structures definition? I wonder if we could focus for a minute on the open land and structures definition. Karen.
Now I have a question about it because of, so what about people who might own a condominium? One of, let's say, 25 condominiums, and those 25 condominiums have 100 acres around them of land that, whatever number of acres, but they have land around them. The use of which might be enhancing the conservation. Anyway, I'm asking,
Again,
does anything have to be carved out for that?
yeah, I think maybe there needs to be more clear language around house sites. Although it wouldn't be a house site because it wouldn't be a homestead, but
Dwelling site.
a dwelling. Yes, condos are a little more complicated. Would that be affordable housing? Would it be, depend on the use, could be considered commercial, it's being rented, could be rental housing.
And they have all kinds of covenants that run with them, so That has to be taken into account, which could change. Association could change the covenant to come in line with the law as we put it, as we classify things. The reason I would like to say, the reason I like the way this open land with these several categories here is that I think it encourages people to think about the importance of land to, for example, protect natural streams or water supply, and then might incentivize people to protect those things on their land, even if they're not in current use. But I don't know if that's, should be part of this, I don't know. Right now, I don't know.
Tom Sims, go ahead.
I think it would be helpful for me to like better understand, again, like what the intent is. Are we trying to be able to produce really good maps? Or are we trying to like set different tax rates and make sure that the use is aligned with the tax rate? Are we trying to identify like the places, like is the hope here to get all the places that don't have any house sites? And then we just need a category that's like has no house site, only has structures and land, and then maybe like a lot of the hypotheticals fall away. If we're just trying to know the parcel that doesn't have a house on it, this language works well for me. If we're imagining that people are gonna have to go through some complicated process to like exclude their house and then know that 75% of the land is open, it seems like that's, I mean, almost any property is gonna probably have some portion of land that is open. So kind of understanding what our goal is would help me understand what we're missing or whether.
I think the top goal is to standardize the grand list for the purposes of both data collection and policy discernment. I think a second goal is that maybe in the future to be able to be more discerning with tax rates so that, you know, one thing that we've heard a lot about during these wild CLA times is that, you know, commercial properties are, have lower value and sort of lower profitability right now, while homes have a much higher value than normal. And so how does that sort of parse out for folks when you're creating an average, right? And so to be able to be more discerning as markets change, or perhaps in the context of municipal land value taxes, if that's a conversation that moves forward. But none of that is even vaguely possible right now, given the way things are structured. So it's really just sort of creating an opportunity for further discerning policymaking in the future with no like clear agenda. I do, in my intent personally, when we were working through this, was that open land and structures is really just land that doesn't have a house or a business, like a building, like a business building on it. And I feel like that's covered before we get to the use of which. But I also, yeah. And like, I guess I'm wondering like, what a gravel parking, like a gravel parking lot that's slowly turning into like a bramble patch, I imagine would be falling into this category of open land and structures. Okay,
And
I think, great.
And just a follow-up question, that like the maybe initial intent of thinking isn't to circle or include the vacation home that has 30 acres, that would be considered the second home or a rental property, like.
I think we could make a policy decision about whether or not we want to have have the building categories be limited to the building footprint the same way we do with our homesteads, or not.
Yes, so I was just gonna say, I don't think this has made that decision as clearly as it could be made. So either you only do the land that only has safe fences or silos on it, or you say, we're gonna take a parcel that has a building on it, but we're gonna carve it out. I don't think this is clear yet as to whether that decision has been made.
I mean, to me, there is a real distinction between those two scenarios, that like a lot that is just a lot and like, you know, some fence or whatever is pretty different than whatever size acreage that has a house and land attached to it. And I think that from my perspective, is a useful distinction to be able to make.
And so what I hear you saying in sort of the context of some of these conversations is that some of these categories should have sort of primacy over other categories. Primacy the word?
Yeah.
I'm using it, but, okay.
Super.
And then
It's like makeup,
to
I
be
feel like I
able-
make up legal terms sometimes since I started doing this.
Yeah, and then like if you have one of the other category, like you can only be eligible for this category if you meet this category's definition.
Yeah.
I mean, that works, right?
I would also, I mean, reason I like this is it just takes away the person that really is using their home as a homestead and just not declaring it, becoming a non-homestead. Maybe sometimes because they don't know what's going on, but other times because they want to be in that category because they don't want to pay their homestead tax rate. They gotta pick one, like you're one of these, prove it, show it.
Yeah, I think in both, I think we have communities, right, where like some folks have an incentive to be a homestead even if they're not, and some folks have an incentive to be a non-homestead if they're not, and we have no,
Control.
yeah.
How many communities is that? Isn't there like 2 or something?
No,
More than that?
it's a number. I mean, I know, it's a number then too. I mean, the homestead and the non-homestead rates are only about 8 or 9 cents apart right now, so,
On average.
on average.
I absolutely lost hands, can we start over? Andrews,
I think Peter was waiting.
Peter,
Yeah, thank you. I want to follow Carl's observation. The number of parcels that are mixed in terms of having a dwelling of some flavor and land are legion. So to help the listeners, frankly, I think it would be better if we did reference a home site and a certain acreage. And for continuity, maybe 2 acres is a good pick because it follows current use, it follows homestead. And that would be inserted in the dwelling unit category. But a secondary point, I'm down on G, I'm sorry to jump ahead, but that's the seasonal. And there again, if somebody, wealthy or not, has 150 acres and a splendid home, but it's weatherized, but it's not there year round, it's not a homestead. I think it would be explicitly useful for the lister again to have an acreage and the dwelling, value that, and the rest is open land and be done with it.
why do you, I guess I'm wondering why you think that would be more useful than the idea that if there's a non-seasonal dwelling on a parcel, then that entire parcel counts as non-seasonal dwelling.
I guess because that's not the way we treat it now. But I, again, I'm sort of thinking about what the learning curve on the ground is at the town level, because they're gonna have to implement this.
Hypothetically, they might not, right?
Excuse me?
We're working on this other bill where hypothetically they wouldn't. In fact, it would be the state who would be doing it. Just,
Oh, I see. Well, they certainly would be having to categorize.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Andrews. This is exciting.
I think
For my
I'm kind
brain.
of jumping ahead as we consider how we value and don't value land. And Carol, I think your point was really valid that, maybe categorizing land this way would motivate people to preserve wild lands outside of current use. But the thing that I keep coming back to in my mind is people who are in current use have made a promise to the state that they are going to maintain those lands, and the people who would be in these categories will not. And I just think we just need to keep in mind that they don't have a promise to do anything.
Maslin, Dunson's.
Kornheiser.
Yeah.
I thought that what I was going to comment on was outside of what we were just talking about, but I think maybe it fits in pretty well with regards to Peter's comments about category, all these comments about categorizing. And where I was settling down is that I would favor sort of keep it simple, stupid, which make the language that works and doesn't get too detailed. An example that I was wondering about is on page 3, I guess, E, rental housing, the words for which landlord is required to submit a landlord certificate, da-da-da. What happens if that changes over time?
I'm going to ask you kindly to stick to
Okay.
not jump ahead to that category.
I'll come back
if
to
you can.
that, but the
Thank you.
issue is the definitions that change over
Yes.
time, and we need to make sure that they're
Yes,
clear.
future proofing.
Okay, I made my point.
That's a very good point.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Representative Andrews, I think helped clarify for me, what I see as a distinction between the kind of open land and structure definition as I read it here. I think if you have a home on a property, it signifies a different level of infrastructure also. That like, if you just sort of exclude the 2 acres and count the rest, it's different than like the parcel that might be up a hill or that doesn't have a driveway and doesn't have power and doesn't have septic, and that I think that there's value distinguishing a parcel that probably has no infrastructure and a parcel that has some that you're maybe excluding. So again, I see some real value in having something that just like, this is undeveloped land, maybe is sort of how I'm reading this one now. And I think there's value in knowing what land is undeveloped.
And I do know that Tax is testifying in the Ag Committee pretty thoroughly about the way parcels being pulled out of current use are valued and sort of those orphaned parcels and how to value them, which I think would maybe us doing that carve out would create that same problem of valuing an orphan parcel because the connection to infrastructure is actually has different value. Carl.
I think I'm just gonna throw this out here, but I think that we've got a structure, if we got a vacation home on 100 acres of land, the more I think about it, the more I think it should just be the value of that building and any associated buildings plus the land underneath it, and not carve anything out, and maybe not even give it this, maybe not even go through this practice of saying, does it do any of these 6 things on there? If it does, they could donate a conservation easement to a conservation organization, or they could go into common use.
Mm-hmm.
And that eliminates the whole issue of having to categorize any of it and carve out a 2 acre or whatever. And I think it goes to Jim's point of just keeping it simple. If it's just raw land that somehow has one of these categories or one or more, I think that's great, but our listers aren't currently trained to identify those categories, and that's the piece that I would worry about, I guess.
So if open land and structures ended at line 11,
Yeah.
would farms still count in that category?
Yes, you still have the including ag land. And there's also that unproductive land definition, which wouldn't be changed. That, if anything, gets at more of what you're discussing, of land that can't be used for forest or ag uses.
But if it's more than 25 acres, then they're eligible to enroll in current use.
Absolutely, that's the overlay.
Yeah.
Representative Sims.
So what happens is one parcel that's a farm that the farmer lives on. Do you have to have 2 treatments then? Because you got the ag land, you got the barns for the animals, but you got a house that is habitable for humans.
I think farmers are already experiencing that.
So that would be homestead. If they're living there, then it's homestead. But then you have a slightly more
That's why we have a flow
situation where you have, maybe you're renting a homestead, or it's not a homestead, renting a home, a dwelling, and then that's the farmer who's using the land. In that case, it would be non-homestead, so it would be categorized under this.
But if it were, and that's where the primacy issue takes place too, right? Yeah, like I drove by a farm today that the owners do not live on, they rent the house to their farm hands. And they have barns.
That would
and
fall
structures.
under probably rental housing, because a landlord certificate would be required for that, because there's someone living there as their domicile.
Before we go to Peter and then Carol, Representative Sims, you took issue with the phrase unproductive land.
I do.
Okay. If you have a better phrase.
I like raw land and land.
I just, you don't have to figure it out now. I would just say like, you know, keep on working on that word and talk to Abby about it. Okay. Peter, Carol.
Pass.
Okay.
That's what I've been struggling with, is what you've asked Representative Sims to think about. Is I don't think that I would want it to be undeveloped land, because that's trying to say, it seems to me to be saying, oh, and so this land could be developed someday. We don't want to, there's risks besides development. And raw land sounds, anyway, I'll talk to her later, but I didn't like unproductive. I didn't like undeveloped. And I didn't like unproductive.
I would also, just given the many definitions of development and developed, that maybe having some other nomenclature would be useful, so.
Those ants are being super productive.
And I imagine that raw is not used anywhere in statute to describe land, so if you would.
Doubt it. I will search.
Yes, Bill, please.
So Abby, in discussion, the last, I don't know, excuse me, there was this talk about a farm with housing for the employees that was exempt. Was that,
Exempt from what?
yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry, I was saying it wouldn't be homestead, because if the owner of the land isn't living in that dwelling, then it would be categorized as non-homestead. Just thinking of maybe an old farmhouse where farm employees are living there, or maybe the farmer themselves is living there and using the land, non-homestead.
I thought I recall when Director Remick was in, that we had changed, the legislature had changed the current use carve out so that a second dwelling could be put on there for, say, employees without having to withdraw a parcel. And that I think solved that problem of not being a homestead, but also not being in agriculture. I don't want to say there isn't still a problem, but I think that change cured that particular scenario.
Sure, I can follow up on that. I know there was the farm building definition added in, but I'm really just speaking to but I'll
okay, sorry.
circle back to that.
It's a great.
Yeah, there's a specific definition for farm buildings and other farm improvements that are actively used by a farmer, are owned by a farmer, or leased to a farmer for a term of 3 years or more. So those would be, that falls into the definition for agricultural land. So it allows those buildings or that use to be part of current use for ag. And I will double check whether that would kick a property out of homestead or not. That's more what I'm, not about the current use, but would that type of situation be categorized under this new structure, or whether it would be homestead?
Thank you.
That's kind of what I'm trying to parse out. Follow up.
Representative Sims.
Consistency with other things is always great, and certainly I think that, like, my preference would be to find a way to like include all the things that have to happen on a farm, including housing for employees, to like be a part of a farm, and that's different than how we might treat other rentals.
Okay.
And so what we're finding out is if that's possibly already happening in other parts of law, and so we don't have to deal with it here, which would be an ideal situation, I think. Yes, Representative Anthony.
I'm back at the beginning, the introduction to 17, all non-homestead property, and I'm reflecting on Representative Odie's puzzle about congregate housing that's not rented. It may be cooperative, it may be condominium in legal form. I think those are homesteads, even though they are congregate. So they're cured in a sense. They're not even part of this. There may be common land that needs to be spoken to here that are usually involved in those congregate developments. And I don't want to get ahead, but it just occurred to me that the owned units are not part of this discussion, but the common land may be part of this discussion.
Yes, owned or not rented. Once they're
Yes.
rented, that's.
Yeah, no, I understand, but
Yes, that's
you
okay.
pay a fee to the association that owns the common land, so it's not rented either.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna close up DI, open land and structures, with the idea that we're gonna work on the word unproductive and end that section at line 11 instead of having the subs in it. Is that,
And clarify the agricultural
Yes.
land includes.
with clarification?
Removed all of those subdivisions about use.
Mhm.
I think I could redraft the main subdivision D without using unproductive land, just bumping that whole definition up, saying that it includes wetlands, lands that are just keeping it within lands, so you're not judging it with the unproductive label.
Otherwise, I'm gonna start judging industrial.
Can't you just repeat the phrase open land, which is the beginning of the section anyway, and close it out with that and avoid the unproductive developed and all that baggage?
I would also, I think we should take out poor soil. It's not poor soil, it's soil that exists. It's just a characteristic of the land.
I think we're taking out all of those sub-bullets.
Oh, we are.
I will work with
Thank you.
legislative council that
Yeah, like,
person that's that's where I got all of that language from. There are similar definitions within current use. So I will work on that. So it's due to unusable soil or something along those lines instead of poor.
not
I don't know the area well enough to say whether that's a term of art or there's some other reason to use that particular adjective. I'll work on that.
Rental housing, E.
Great, so moving on to page 3, line 3. Oops, I just moved my, sorry. Okay, I'll go on.
Line 6 for us.
Thank you. I'll go on to what's online. Line 6, rental housing is a dwelling unit for which a landlord is required to submit a landlord certificate. So in 2020, the legislature did change the landlord certificate reporting requirements. So now any rental unit for which there is a landlord, the landlord has to submit a certificate to the Department of Taxes. So that's why that was chosen here, is just because it's so broad.
That's logical, but I wondered what would happen if we did away with the certificate. You know, it's
Correct.
gets
That would-
discussed once in a while, and I wonder if there's I mean, you get the point. I don't need to go on. There's a language that would work regardless, you know.
It is very broad. I can tell you what that requirement is. I think it's just any rental unit.
Understood.
Wouldn't count.
I can pull that up.
That was put in.
Yes, the owner of each rental property. The owner also, owner of the land.
So there's no minimum number of,
That was prior law. It used to be 2 or more. So if you only had one rental property, you did not have, the landlord did not have to submit a certificate, and now all properties that are rented have to be declared.
so it seems like if it's all rental properties, they have to be declared. Is there any reason not just to say all rental properties?
Well, then what's the definition, I guess?
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering if we're hearing from both Jim and Catherine is the idea that we could duplicate the language describing why someone would need a landlord certificate into this section. And then, or we could wait until the landlord certificate changes and then duplicate that language, but we'd have to remember you'd have, whoever is in your position would have to remember the cross references. And I don't know what your system.
Always search those. Because that does have it should pop up in a search. just also realizing, so in the landlord certificate requirements, it also applies where someone owns land. The owner of land rented as a portion of a homestead in the prior calendar year shall furnish a certificate of rent to the department and to each claimant who owned a portion of the homestead and rented that land. So that gets at when an individual has typically a manufactured home on land. So there's also all of those individuals would be reported on a landlord certificate, and all of those would be considered properties.
For lot rent, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
So that language would, I don't know if you'd want to import that as well. The current reference does pull in all of those individuals too.
Anthony.
I have ringing in my brain the phrase that rental properties are dwelling units that are customarily leased by the month or for 30 days or longer, some phrase like that. And I can't recall where I saw that, but it gets around the issue of whether there's a certificate or that program has changed. It's just we are leasing by a longer period than a motel, an Airbnb, et cetera, which then falls into another category. That's the way around it, I think.
The ringing in my brain goes to meals and rooms tax, because there is a distinction, and when you're renting for 30 days or more, you become a permanent occupant and you're no longer.
That's where I'm
meals and rooms.
remembering.
That might be intent there. However, this also, the way it's currently drafted and requiring the landlord certificate does not include short-term rentals short-term rentals, because those would fall into the seasonal or non-seasonal secondary dwellings. So that's the only sort of flag that I would have. Do you want those? I assume you don't want those within the rental housing. You want it more someone who's
Quite correct, we don't, but I'm just getting around
Yep.
maintaining the duration feature without the certificate feature.
So Abby, can you work on the idea of having E be sort of a self-contained definition?
Sure, absolutely. Can we jump to G then, because it's also used again there? I think what I might redraft for that sub I on lines 19 and 20 is just to say which does not constitute a rental housing dwelling.
So we have 5 minutes. What do folks think about tackling seasonal dwellings in 5 minutes? Getting some.
Warm it up.
Okay, let's warm it up.
Warm it up.
What I will offer before Abby jumps in is an acknowledgement that this is mostly going to be sort of hunting camps, and there might be like 3 really beautiful homes on Lake Champlain that would also wind up in this definition, and like such is life. To you, Abby.
But what if I build the camp with 3 friends and reward them?
Abby.
This is another definition that gets complicated very quickly, like the open land. Starting with F, seasonal dwelling is a dwelling that is not weatherized for year-round occupancy. And this is one way that this new draft is changed, trying to flesh out this definition more with some language that's used for accessory dwelling units, as well as looking at some other states that try and get at, again, this idea of a camp versus something that's usable year-round. So there's language that says which shall be established, so establishing the not being weatherized aspect by the absence of basic amenities or utilities required for year-round occupancy or use, and that includes permanent heating, insulation, or year-round usable plumbing. So that is, I'm not sure how many more valuable second homes would fall into this, given that those most likely have plumbing and heating and insulation. And again, just to clarify that this does not apply to domiciles rented or occupied in any way. That second on line 12, that second subdivision excludes anyone who's living there as their domicile. Secondary non-seasonal dwelling, so these really work sort of in opposition to each other, is a dwelling that's weatherized.
Does the seasonal dwelling definition work for people on first glance?
Yes.
Oh, look at that. Check.
Bingo.
Okay,
Before lunch.
I think with that, we're gonna stop.
Quit while you're at it.
Okay, thank you very much, Abby. I think you have some work to do and we have some thinking to do. Thank you. So at 11 o'clock, which is in 3 minutes, we are gonna talk about Secretary of State fees.